The stinging heat on my cheek from my mother's slap was nothing compared to the coldness in her eyes as my brother Mark tossed my suitcases into a mud puddle. "Dad is gone, and so is your welcome," she spat, locking the door to the home I had spent 10 years protecting. They thought they were throwing me out like trash, but they didn't realize they were just handing me the keys to their own destruction. By the time they realize their inheritance is actually my weapon, it will be too late to save their souls or their bank accounts. My name is Kelly, and for a long time I believed that family was a circle you never broke, no matter how much it hurt to keep holding hands. I was the reliable one. In every family there's a giver and a taker, and in the Vance household the roles were cast before I could even walk. My brother Mark was the golden boy, the one whose every mediocre achievement was toasted with champagne. My mother Evelyn lived for the optics of our family name, and then there was me. I was the daughter who stayed. 10 years ago my life was in Seattle. I had a burgeoning career in architectural design, a tiny apartment with a view of the water, and a future that belonged entirely to me. Then came the phone call. Dad was diagnosed with aggressive Parkinson's. Evelyn didn't even ask. She told me I had to come home because Mark was too busy building his empire, and she simply couldn't handle the emotional toll. So I packed my life into boxes and drove across the country. I didn't know then that I was driving into a 10-year prison sentence of my own making. I spent 3,650 days as my father's primary caregiver. While Mark was posting photos from yachts in Ibiza and luxury villas in Saint-Tropez, I was learning how to navigate the terrifying world of tremors, hallucinations, and fading memories. I wasn't just his daughter, I was his nurse, his chef, his driver, and his protector. I remember the smell of antiseptic and old paper that became my world. I remember the weight of his hand in mine during the midnight fevers. His fingers trembling as he tried to tell me something he couldn't quite find the words for. But it wasn't just my time I gave, it was my life's blood. Over that decade, I burned through exactly $85,422 of my own savings. Why? Because every time a specialized medical bed was needed or a wheelchair-accessible van had to be purchased, Evelyn would sigh and claim that the family accounts were tied up in investments. She'd be wearing a new Chanel suit while I was swiping my own credit card to pay for Dad's physical therapy. I did it without a second thought. I loved him. He was the only one who truly saw me. Sometimes, he'd squeeze my hand and whisper, "I've taken care of you, Kelly girl. You'll see. I've made sure they can't hurt you." I thought he was talking about the strength he had instilled in me. I thought he meant he had raised me to be resilient. I never dreamed he had seen the vultures circling him even then. I never dreamed he knew his own wife and son were waiting for his heart to stop just so they could check the balance of his estate. I worked myself to the bone, my youth slipping away in the quiet hallways of our family manor, while Mark and Evelyn treated me like the hired help who happened to share their DNA. I was just Kelly, the live-in nurse who didn't need a salary because she had the privilege of living in the big house. I sacrificed my career, my relationships, and my bank account for 10 years, thinking I was building a legacy of love. In reality, I was just fattening up the prize for the two people who hated me for my devotion. I believed in the goodness of my mother and brother. I believed they were just grieving differently. How wrong I was. The rain in Virginia that afternoon wasn't a gentle mist. It was a heavy, suffocating downpour that seemed to soak right through my skin and into my bones. We had just lowered Dad into the earth. My black dress was heavy with moisture, and my feet felt leaden in the mud. As the last of the mourners whispered their hollow condolences and scurried to their luxury SUVs, I stood there for a moment longer, staring at the fresh mound of dirt. My heart felt like it had been hollowed out with a scoop. I was exhausted. 10 years of caregiving exhaustion that finally hit me all at once. All I wanted was to go back to my room, the one I'd occupied for a decade, and sleep for a week. When I pulled the van into the long, winding driveway of the estate, something felt wrong. The exterior lights, which I always kept on for safety, were dark. I walked up the stone steps, fumbling in my bag for my keys. I slid the brass key into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. I tried again, pushing with my shoulder, thinking the old wood had swollen from the rain. Nothing. The door swung open abruptly, but it wasn't a warm welcome. Mark stood there, dressed in a bespoke Italian suit that probably cost more than 3 months of Dad's medication. He wasn't crying. He looked energized. He looked like he'd just won the lottery. Behind him, my mother, Evelyn, was holding a crystal glass of scotch, her eyes dry and sharp as flint. "Keys don't work, Kelly?" Mark asked, his voice dripping with a fake oily sympathy. "That's because I had the locksmith out here while you were at the wake. New chapter, new locks." I stared at him, my brain struggling to process the words. "What are you talking about, Mark? I need to get inside. I'm freezing. I need to change." "You aren't going inside," Evelyn said, stepping forward. She didn't sound like my mother. She sounded like a stranger delivering an eviction notice. "We've reviewed the new will, Kelly. Your father left the entirety of the estate to Mark. He realized at the end that a woman with no career and no assets couldn't possibly maintain a property of this stature. You were a wonderful nurse, dear, truly. But the term of your employment has ended." "Nurse?" I whispered, the word tasting like acid. "I'm his daughter. I've lived here for 10 years. I paid for the renovations to the ground floor out of my own pocket. I paid for the van you're standing next to." "Correction," Mark sneered, stepping onto the porch. "You stayed here for free while the rest of us did the heavy lifting of maintaining the family's social standing. You lived off Dad, and now the ride is over." He reached down and grabbed 2 suitcases I hadn't even noticed sitting by the door. With a grunt, he heaved them off the porch. They tumbled down the steps, one of them bursting open. My journals, 10 years of notes on Dad's health, my sketches, my private thoughts, spilled into a muddy puddle. "You can't do this," I said, my voice trembling as I stepped toward the door. "This is my home." I tried to push past Mark, but Evelyn moved with a speed that shocked me. Crack. The slap was so hard my ears rang. My head snapped to the side, and for a second all I could see were white spots. The heat on my cheek was instantaneous. "Don't you dare raise your voice in my house," Evelyn hissed, her face inches from mine. "You were a servant who overstayed her welcome. You are a trespasser now, Kelly. If you aren't off this property in 5 minutes, Mark is calling the police to have you removed for trespassing. Take your trash and get out." They stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door. The sound of the deadbolt clicking home felt like a gunshot. I stood there in the pouring rain, the side of my face throbbing, looking at my life's work rotting in the mud. I looked at the windows of the house I had kept clean, the house where I had held my father's hand as he took his last breath. They were silhouettes against the warm glow of the interior, my mother and my brother, already celebrating my exile. I didn't scream. I didn't pound on the door until my knuckles bled. I knelt in the mud, slowly gathering my soaked journals. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. A new sensation was beginning to override the grief and the shock. It was a slow, bubbling heat. They thought they had won. They thought they had played the perfect hand. But as I lugged my ruined suitcases to the van they didn't realize was registered solely in my name, I remembered the look in my father's eyes during those last weeks. He wasn't confused. He was focused. And I knew, deep in my gut, that he hadn't left me defenseless. The motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner, a far cry from the lavender-scented halls of the Vance estate. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, my damp clothes clinging to my skin, and pulled the one thing I had managed to save from the mud. My father's old, battered leather briefcase. Mark had ignored it during his clean-out, probably because the brass buckles were tarnished and the leather was scuffed. To a man who only valued what glittered, this was just old man junk. But to me, it was everything. My father used to tap this briefcase and wink at me when Evelyn and Mark were out spending his money. My hands trembled as I pried open the sticking latch. Inside weren't just old tax returns or medical receipts. Tucked into a hidden, silk-lined pocket, a detail Dad had shown me when I was a little girl, was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with heavy wax and addressed to me in his shaky, unmistakable handwriting. "For my Kelly girl. To be opened only when the wolves come." I tore it open. My breath hitched as I pulled out a stack of legal documents embossed with the seal of a high-end law firm in Richmond. Not the family lawyers Evelyn used, but a firm Dad had retained in secret years ago. At the very top, in bold letters, it read, "The Kelly Vance Irrevocable Living Trust." I'm an architect by training. I'm used to reading complex blueprints and contracts, but I had to read these lines 4 times before the reality sank in. 5 years ago, realizing that his Parkinson's was progressing and seeing the predatory greed in Mark and Evelyn's eyes, Dad had moved the entire property, the house, the 5 acres of prime Virginia land, and the detached guest house, out of his personal name and into this trust. According to the documents, the will Mark had been waving around was effectively a piece of scrap paper. You cannot bequeath an asset you no longer own. The house didn't belong to my father when he died. It belonged to the trust. And I was the sole trustee and the 100% beneficiary. The weight of the betrayal I'd suffered hours ago began to shift. The sting on my cheek from Evelyn's slap didn't hurt as much anymore. It was replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. They had thrown me out of a house that was legally mine. They had changed the locks on my door. But then, a darker, more brilliant thought took hold. If I went to the police tonight, they'd be evicted, sure. But they still had their savings. They still had their pride. They would just find another way to grift. No. Dad had given me a weapon, and I was going to use it to build a trap they would walk into willingly. I looked at the documents again. Under the terms of the trust, any unauthorized improvements or alterations made to the property by non-owners without a formal lease agreement would be considered permanent additions to the trust's assets. I realized that if I stayed quiet, if I let them believe they had one, Mark's greed would do the work for me. He wouldn't just live there. He would try to flip it. I leaned back against the headboard. A slow smile finally breaking through the trauma. Go ahead, Mark. I whispered into the empty room. Spend every dime you have. Make my house beautiful. The hardest part wasn't the poverty. It was the silence. For 6 months, I became a ghost. I moved into a cramped 1-bedroom apartment downtown, working a freelance drafting job to keep the lights on. I blocked Evelyn and Mark on everything. I didn't want them to hear a whisper of my voice, and I certainly didn't want them to know I was watching. But I was watching. Every single day. I knew my brother. Mark didn't have the patience for a long-term investment. He wanted the big score. Within 3 weeks of my father's funeral, I saw the first building permit hit the county website. He hadn't even waited for the mourning period to end before he started tearing my father's legacy apart. He filed for a massive renovation permit under a shell company, Vance Luxury Developments. He was going to turn our warm Victorian family home into a cold, modern smart estate to flip it for a projected $2.5 million. I used to spend my lunch breaks parked a block away from the estate, hidden behind the tinted windows of my van. I watched the parade of contractor trucks, plumbers, electricians, landscapers. I watched as they ripped out the antique oak flooring I had hand-waxed for years. I saw them dump the stained glass windows Dad loved into a construction bin. It hurt to see the history being gutted, but I kept my eyes on the ledger in my head. Mark was over-leveraged. I knew his financial history better than he thought. He had liquidated his entire stock portfolio, and most importantly, he had convinced Evelyn to sign over her 401k and her widow's pension to fund the project. They were all in. They thought they were doubling their money. In reality, they were pouring their life savings into a foundation that didn't belong to them. I met with my attorney, Mr. Henderson, once a month. I'd show him the photos of the progress. They've added a $150,000 Italian marble kitchen today, I'd tell him. They just finished a $200,000 infinity pool in the backyard. Henderson would just shake his head, a grim smile on his face. Kelly, I've seen some revenge cases in my time, but this is surgical. Since there is no lease and they are technically squatters with a forged claim, every dollar they spend is considered a gratuitous improvement to the trust. They are legally gifting you their entire net worth. The temptation to stop them was strong sometimes, especially when I saw them selling off Dad's antique furniture at a yard sale, but I held my breath. I needed them to be completely, irrevocably broke. I waited until I saw the for sale sign go up on the front lawn. It was a gold-plated sign, flashing with the arrogance of a man who thought he'd finally made it. I checked the real estate listings. Mark had staged the house with rented designer furniture. He was throwing a grand opening gala for elite buyers. He'd even invited the local press to cover the transformation of the Vance Manor. He was at the peak of his hubris. He was days away from a multi-million-dollar closing that would have left me in the dust forever. I spent that final night looking at the original trust documents one last time. I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't the broken girl in the mud anymore. I was the architect of their downfall. I had allowed them to build their own gallows out of Carrara marble and high-end fixtures. They had stolen my past, so I had decided to own their future. "Tomorrow, Mark," I whispered to the dark ceiling of my apartment, "tomorrow the bill finally comes due." The night of the gala was a perfect crisp Virginia evening. As I pulled my van up to the curb a block away, I could see the estate glowing like a diamond. The modern LED floodlights Mark had installed washed the ancient brick in a cold, expensive white. Valet drivers in vests were scurrying around, parking Porsches and Mercedes along the driveway where I had once hauled bags of mulch and oxygen tanks. It was the Vulture's Ball, and everyone was invited. Except for the person who actually owned the dirt they were standing on. I stepped out of the van wearing the same black dress I had worn to my father's funeral. I had cleaned it, pressed it, and kept it as a reminder of the day I was slapped into a new reality. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a reckoning. As I walked up the driveway, I saw Mark at the center of a circle of wealthy investors near the new infinity pool. He was holding a glass of champagne, his chest puffed out, gesturing toward the house. "We kept the soul of the place," I heard him boast, but gave it the luxury it truly deserved. Evelyn was nearby, draped in a new silk wrap, laughing with a local socialite. She looked younger, energized by the scent of a fresh fortune. Neither of them saw me until I was 10 feet away. The laughter died first. It started with Evelyn. Her glass hit the stone patio with a sharp clink as she recognized me. "Kelly," she gasped, her voice tightening with immediate vitriol. "What on earth are you doing here? I told you, trespassers will be prosecuted. Mark, get her out of here." Mark turned, his smug grin curdling into a snarl. He excused himself from the investors and marched toward me, his face turning a deep angry purple. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here in that rag, Kelly. You want another scene? Because I'll have the guards drag you out in front of everyone. This is a private event for serious buyers. I'm not here to buy, Mark," I said, my voice calm and projecting just enough for the surrounding guests to turn their heads. "I'm here to inspect my property." "Your property?" Mark laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "The grief has finally made you delusional. I have the will. I have the deed in my name. I've spent 6 months and $600,000 making this place worth something. Now, get lost before I lose my temper." "You spent $600,000? I asked, tilting my head. "That's a lot of money to spend on someone else's house. Did you check the title, Mark? Or did you just assume that forged will was enough to bypass the law?" I signaled to the 2 men who had been waiting by the gate. One was Mr. Henderson, carrying a leather portfolio. The other was a deputy sheriff in full uniform. The crowd went silent. The only sound was the splashing of the $200,000 waterfall Mark had installed. "Mark Vance." "Evelyn Vance," the deputy asked, stepping into the light. "What is this?" Evelyn hissed, clutching her silk wrap. "This is a mistake. My son owns this estate." "Actually, Mr. Henderson stepped forward, opening the portfolio and handing a set of certified documents to the deputy. "The property known as the Vance Estate was moved into an irrevocable living trust 5 years ago. Mr. Mark Vance is not a trustee. Neither is Mrs. Evelyn Vance. The sole owner of this land, this house, and every single improvement you've made to it is Kelly Vance." Mark reached out, grabbing the papers from the deputy's hand. I watched his eyes dart across the lines. Trustee, Kelly Vance. Beneficiary, Kelly Vance. Assets, all real property. His hands began to shake. The champagne glass in his other hand was trembling so hard the liquid bubbled over the rim. "This is fake," he stammered, looking at the wealthy buyers who were now whispering and pulling out their phones. This is a trick. I have the will. Dad signed the will. Dad didn't own the house when he signed that will, Mark. I said, stepping closer so only he and my mother could hear me. He knew exactly what you were. He knew you'd try to throw me out. So, he gave me the house 5 years ago and then I waited. I waited while you spent every cent of your savings. I waited while you emptied Mom's retirement. I let you build my dream home with your blood and your greed. And now, you're done. The deputy stepped forward, placing a hand on his belt. Mr. Vance, we have an order for your immediate ejection. Furthermore, based on the affidavit provided by the Trust's counsel regarding the forged signatures on the deed transfer you filed last month, I have a warrant for your arrest for deed fraud. The grand opening turned into a crime scene in seconds. The wealthy buyers scattered like cockroaches when the lights come on. Mark didn't go quietly. He screamed. He cursed. And he wept as the handcuffs were clicked around his wrists. The very wrists that had tossed my life into the mud. I stood on the marble balcony, the one my mother had insisted on to add a touch of class, and watched the red and blue lights of the patrol car fade into the distance. The silence that followed was heavy and sweet. The caterers had fled. The elite buyers had vanished. And the first time in 10 years, the house felt light. The suffocating weight of my mother's narcissism and my brother's greed had been purged from these walls. The aftermath was a landslide of justice. Because Mark had used a forged will to attempt a fraudulent deed transfer, a felony in this state, the district attorney didn't go easy on him. He was sentenced to 7 years for deed fraud and elder financial abuse. Every penny he had poured into the renovations was legally classified as a gift to the trust because he had no lease and no ownership. He entered prison not just a criminal, but a pauper. My mother, Evelyn, fared even worse. Without Mark to hide behind, she was forced to face the reality of her own choices. She had signed over her entire retirement fund to Marks Vance Luxury Developments, thinking she was securing a life of leisure. When the company collapsed under the weight of the fraud charges, her money vanished into a black hole of restitution and legal fees. The woman who used to mock those people in low-income housing found herself living in a cramped, state-funded senior apartment on the edge of town. She tried to call me once, weeping into the phone about family loyalty. I didn't yell. I didn't even get angry. I simply reminded her of the sting on my cheek and the mud on my journals. You said I was just the nurse, Mom. I told her calmly. And a nurse's job is to see the patient through to the end. Your life with me has reached its end. Then, I hung up and blocked her number for good. I didn't keep the modern monstrosity they built. It didn't feel like Dad anymore. I sold the renovated estate for $2.8 million. After paying back my $85,000 in savings and settling Dad's remaining affairs, I was left with a fortune that would ensure I never had to be reliable for anyone else ever again. I bought a small, quiet cottage by the coast in Washington. A place with no marble, no infinity pools, and no ghosts. I spent my mornings sketching the ocean and my afternoons volunteering at a local hospice, helping people who truly have no one. Sometimes, when the wind blows cold off the water, I touch my cheek. I can still feel the ghost of that slap, but it doesn't hurt. It's a reminder that I survived. I realized that karma isn't just a coincidence. It's a blueprint. My father drew the lines. My brother built the structure, and I, the architect, just waited for the right moment to move in. I am no longer the victim. I am the owner of my life, and the locks on my door will never be changed again. Sitting here today looking out at the ocean, I still find it hard to believe how far I've come from that rainy afternoon in the mud. For 10 years, I thought my silence was a sign of love, but I finally realized that standing up for yourself is the ultimate form of self-respect. My brother and mother tried to steal my past, but in the end, their own greed became the architect of their ruin. Looking back at everything I went through, do you think I did the right thing by letting them spend their savings before striking? Or was I too cold? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What did you learn from my journey? If you found value in my story today, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to join us daily. Until next time.